The other day, I had a conversation with the president of the small local nonprofit that I sit on the board. And we were noodling on this idea that the nonprofit has a certain amount of cash. We're raising and spending money, and just thinking about what does that mean in this market environment. We've also got some new folks coming onto the board, and how do you train them and get them up to speed with all the various things that have to happen as the board of the nonprofit. And as I was thinking about this, I thought I have got to ask Maya. So I reached out to my friend and fellow mastermind group member, Maya Tussing, who is a specialist at financial advisor who works with nonprofits to develop resilient organizations. And so we started chit-chatting about this, and it turned into this episode of the Real Life Planning Podcast. This is episode 20 of the Real Life Planning Podcast with Maya Tussing of Fairlight Advisors. Maya, tell us what's important to know about you.
Thank you, Cynthia, for inviting me to speak with you today. What should you know about me? I worked in corporate America for decades before I went on my own with collaborating with my partner, Catherine Earhart, to launch Fairlight. And I think it was a good turning point in my career to have worked in some of the largest financial services companies in the world and be able to parlay that experience to smaller clients. You talked about my working with nonprofits. I worked with really large foundations and endowments and pension funds as a portfolio manager for BlackRock, but being able to take a lot of that robust and Wall Street rigor that you learn in the corporate world, as you have, Cynthia, as well, and be able to bring that to smaller clients and nonprofits that don't have access to that has been really rewarding.
And how is it that you settled on this clientele as a niche that you wanted to work with? What life experiences did you have that led you to wanting to help nonprofits? And if I understand correctly, I mean, from working together in our mastermind group, you're mostly working in the small to medium sized nonprofit space, folks that aren't currently well served with traditional financial services and often really need a lot of help and guidance in different areas.
My career has really been working with institutions, whether big or small. I spent many years as a risk manager within organizations helping product groups and operations to be more efficient. At the same time, I was sitting on small boards, nonprofits with a budget of $1 million to 10 million, which is considered small, very small, and really trying to survive and thrive with so little, and with boards who are very passionate, but really it's a volunteer job. So you get what you get. And so I'm being able to combine my experience of helping small teams. And that's typically, what a nonprofit is. It's a small team. Often they'll have only 5 people working who are on staff, but they really have to rely on the larger ecosystem to help them out, their boards, their leadership, their partners. That I really enjoyed. A story that kind of inspired Catherine and me to launch Fairlight is we had been fundraising for a nonprofit that did microfinancing for low-income women entrepreneurs. We raised our own money, other executives at the company, and through the foundation about $250,000. Within a couple weeks, the nonprofit failed. This is something, as a donor, you don't know what's under the hood often. We were just major donors to this nonprofit. And through the grapevine, we learned that they grew too fast. There's a lot of mismanagement of grants and the like. It was a sad and heartbreaking and frustrating story to go through so much. And we had a lot of friends in that organization. We knew the beneficiaries of that organization, and for it, poof, to just go. It was a mighty nonprofit that had been very important, but something like mismanagement of money can really quickly destroy and collapse a nonprofit. And we didn't want that to happen. So we wanted to be able to share our knowledge for those who are willing to listen about how to manage money, and at least also bring partners who had deep experience, like you, accountants and IT professionals and marketers who may have deep expertise and corporate expertise, but really want to work with small nonprofits as well to give back.
So I think that's wonderful, and there really isn't anyone doing it besides your firm, as far as I know. As somebody who's been on various boards in various positions over my whole grown up life, basically, I've seen as a board member, I've seen a couple of different situations, and I was wondering if you could maybe jump in and talk about them. One, I've seen a situation where the board has responsibility for approving budgets and plans of a relatively substantial amount of money, but they just raise the dough. They just defer to the executive director and the financial team of the nonprofit, right? They're not necessarily understanding the financial statements that come to them. They are delegating everything to the staff. I've also seen situations where the professional staff is really focused on delivering the mandate of the nonprofit to the end users, whoever that is, and has in turn delegated all of the financial management of the organization to the board. I don't know if you've come across either situation and how in both of those situations that isn't necessarily resilient.
Yeah. Okay. So I can talk about the first one. The first example where you have a board that basically relinquishes their accountability for the finances and the operations. I've heard a consultant tell me it's almost like the lighthouse, the guiding light for this and to advise the staff and the executive director. But at the same time, I've seen some really disastrous situations where, and I can count numerous situations in which you have a really smart, very capable executive director who can shield or is a bit opaque about what is going on for the board. The board's a volunteer. They may try to lift up the rock. And I don't want to suggest that anybody is working, there's any malice here. It can get to the point where there aren't really some nice things to see under that rock, but board members are too afraid to know. And then when they find out, it's a lot of work to fix it. It's very easy to be naive about what's going on under the hood because a lot of these smaller and even mid-sized nonprofits are doing the best they can to deliver on the mission. And sometimes they will make some egregious mistakes, maybe at the time seems valid, but could be ethically wrong or against the law based on moving grants around that are supposed to be targeted for a certain thing. Maybe there are even government grants that are supposed to do something. Saying,
So
oh,
maybe you
like
send those funds with other operational funds.
yeah, we really need it for this program. But the grantor said, no, you need to do this. That's a no-no. And you as a board are not going to be able to see a lot of that unless you bring in an attorney or an auditor and tell them I'm looking for that sort of thing. Your other example is the opposite, where you have a staff that's probably very overworked and they have to relinquish.
Right.
So-
Maybe a super small, like a super small startup organization. They don't necessarily have a really experienced staff. Yeah.
One woman was telling me, she was a consultant to a nonprofit. She told me the executive director had asked someone on the board who worked for a big bank to be responsible for the financials of the organization. And this board member who worked for this national bank told this consultant, I'm an IT professional. Don't really know anything about financial statements. But this individual was the only person that was close to the financial services industry. And he said, I don't know anything about, I'm not an accountant. I'm not an auditor. I don't know anything about nonprofit finance. Yet he was too afraid to speak up. So those are two situations where, and it's a reality within the nonprofit world, they're often under resourced and someone has to do it. And there is either not enough
Mhm.
oversight from the board, or the board in a volunteer capacity is expected to do things that actually should be hired for as a staff position within
Mhm.
the organization.
So, what's interesting is that I have my windows open and there looks like there's this lovely insect flying around.
I know. I
so,
think it's something.
so I hope
Yeah.
it's not too distracting. Uh, but getting back to the topic of nonprofits, right? As somebody who tries to actively volunteer and give a certain percentage of time and income,
Mhm.
I'm really interested in what you think makes a resilient nonprofit. Like, how could those of us who are serving in some capacity in a volunteer role, what should we be looking for in terms of developing a more resilient organization? What are the questions to ask the executive director or the professional staff, for example, about that might lead them to implement some of these ideas?
One thing that, based on talking to experts, and I should say professionals who service nonprofits, particularly in the fundraising space. And I'm not an expert in that, but I know enough to be dangerous.
Mhm.
And donations are the lifeblood of the nonprofit, or, could be earned revenue as well.
Sure.
And that should be a focus of the organization, making friends and networking. The gala and the events have long been an ineffective way of fundraising for nonprofits. The COVID shutdown really put a nail in that coffin.
The big gala and the silent auction. Not that those things don't have a role as a deadline to bring in other types of donations. It can't necessarily be everything. Right.
And they're just so expensive
Yeah.
for what they deliver. And depending on where you live, and I'm in the Bay Area where hotel space and all that is exorbitant. So if
Mhm.
a plate for two, maybe you're paying $200 a plate, and you're hoping that each of those people donate more than $200, which is very unlikely. I mean, you're better off just doing individual donations, doing maybe small events, coffees, speaking at lectures, trying to get the message out that you talked about. The gala or the party has a role, but maybe it has more of a role for goodwill and not as a fundraising tool,
Mhm.
more as getting the word out of what we do and where we are placed in the community. The research has shown 70% of your donations, typically for the average nonprofit, should be small individual donations. And those are small. We've talked about in the political campaign arena, and I believe you've worked in that. And that's very important to build true believers who over time will increase those donations and maybe leave an estate many decades later. This is really a long game. And I think a lot of new nonprofits say, hey, we want to have our gala. You're not going to really make that much. It's really a slow process. I
So
think,
just to summarize
yeah,
that, so that the number one thing is making sure that the organization has a consistent, proactive plan to build the number of donors, not just the amount of the individual donations.
the goals should
Yeah.
be in their strategic plan.
Yeah.
How are you going to do this? What kind of infrastructure are you going to build? There's going to be a CRM system and engaging your board.
Mm.
Board is not there. It used to be to rub elbows and glad hand and build your own business kind of network. But really finding board members who take this mission seriously and are
Want to
willing.
put gas in the engine.
Exactly. It used to be that you wanted to recruit a bunch of rich people so they would write checks, when we know that's not effective either, because a lot of rich people don't give to even the nonprofits they sit on the board to. Diversifying that board so you have people who actually understand that community, maybe even grew up in the community if it's underrepresented or underserved communities that they're sitting on the board, so they know how to talk to that community. but also that are going to be part of that fundraising machine, whether it's writing the checks, asking for the checks, saying thank you to those who wrote checks, to putting on small events, being part of programs. You want people on your board to have skin in the game somehow, realizing that bringing in money toward the mission should be your number one goal.
Mhm. Oh, I think that's so well said, bringing in money toward
And I
the mission. Yeah.
and those of us in for profit make that, well, isn't that obvious? No, to a lot of nonprofits, that isn't not obvious. It's often the mission is saving children,
Right.
saving the environment, but you can't do that without money. And that's
Right.
kind of
With that.
the rub.
Mm. Right. Donations are the revenue of the nonprofit, right? Donations or grant money or the
Earned revenue,
earned revenue, like whatever.
Girl Scout cookies,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So the foundation, right? The strong financial foundation, just like in somebody's personal financial plan, is bringing in
Mhm.
income.
Correct.
What would the next category be of a resilient nonprofit?
Just like any family financial situation
Mhm.
or a business, you want to grow. I think it's unfortunate that the term of art is a nonprofit because we presume that organization will not bring in more income than they're taking out. But building that financial foundation for growth, because every organization needs to innovate with the times. They
Mhm.
need to also be prepared for the unexpected, which we have gone for the last 2 years. Before that, I think I mentioned my background was in risk management. And when I first started doing this, I just couldn't get arrested within the nonprofit world. There was not much of an understanding of what nonprofit risk management was. Large national ones, they operate like a corporation, so they would understand these. But the small and mid-sized nonprofits thought, we don't bring in a lot, we have very small margins. What is risk management?
And are those folks the first people that really were blindsided by the change
Exactly.
during the pandemic? Yeah.
For COVID. It worked out for some and not for others. I remember before the pandemic, there was this question of how much is it that we need to hold in reserves for an emergency? How many months is it? And I thought it was such a strange question because, as we all know, come from an individual perspective and from a business, it all depends on how risky you are, what are your challenges, how robust you are, and the like.
Do you have diversified sources of revenue or income, or in this case, donations? Yeah.
There was this belief that there was an easy formula and it made sense for everyone.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not the case. Some nonprofits hold loads of cash. You and I are in the investment world. I'm not sure I would do that, but for some, it's very necessary. Other nonprofits, most nonprofits are only holding a couple months of cash, which will only really allow them to survive paying their staff for a few months.
And their mortgage or their rent and all the other expenses. Yeah.
Exactly. There are capacity grants out there. There's fundraising for a reserve. I saw one nonprofit had a major donor who said,
Mhm.
I am writing a check of $100,000 as an operating reserve, which means I want you not to touch it and put a policy around it and put it in a safe place. Maybe it's a money market or some treasury, or get some advice on where you should put it. But this is not for programs. Those are great.
For financial ballast.
Those are great donations. And I really advocate that nonprofits should be fundraising for those types.
Mhm.
Programs are important, but you're not going to have programs if you can't survive the next pandemic.
If you can't keep the lights on. Yeah. So let's dig into, we've got two ideas here, one of which is risk management and the other which is investing for the future. So let's take the risk management part first. And I know that Fairlight does, as part of your services, you offer a risk management assessment, basically. So talk a little bit about what that is. What are the different categories, subcategories that you're looking at in terms of risk? And what are the typical challenges that face that kind of small to medium size nonprofit?
So you alluded to one is the diversification of your income sources. Are you concentrated in government grants or a particular donor or a particular revenue stream, is understanding where that comes from. And a lot of nonprofits are starting to do that. Getting away from that concentration is very hard because it requires building up an expertise and a channel to another donor group. But that is one area. You talked about rent and facilities is huge. Do they own their property? Do they rent or are they virtual? We found during the pandemic, and you within real estate would know this, a lot of nonprofits had absolutely no clue what their lease agreements said
Mhm.
with their landlords. There were a lot of landlords that may not have been so kind to nonprofits. They didn't care. They wanted the highest paying renter. And we don't care whether you're helping homeless children in our community. You can go find something else. Or, God forbid, the revenue slowed, yet their landlord was increasing their rent. So facilities is huge. There's some nonprofits that actually need a facility, some are buying them, or there's a donor that's donating them.
Mhm.
But as the cost of maintaining um,
Sure.
is huge, and many they don't realize you have to staff that. There are a lot of
Mhm.
costs that come with that. So that's another one. Something that has become quite obvious to many of us users is technology. Many nonprofits were not using technology really effectively, or were underestimating cyber security risk.
Especially if they are collecting some kind of personal information from their end users. Yeah.
Particularly in the same way we've seen that elderly are targeted for cybercrime, small nonprofits tend to be targeted for cybercrime
Wow.
because
Huh.
they often don't, they have a lot of holes in their system and they often are not going to say anything about it. Often there's the thought, isn't it going to be the big nonprofits or the big corporations that are going to be hit? No, a lot of these fraudsters go after those small organizations and take 10,000. I knew one small nonprofit where they almost lost $1 million through a fraudster that stalked them for a year within their email system and then posed
Wow,
as
that's
the
terrifying.
CFO.
Uh-huh.
So that's another that can really kill a nonprofit. HR is huge. It's the biggest in a business and a nonprofit's the biggest expense. What's the morale, your management? Are you turnover?
Mhm.
Um,
Right.
and
Just like any employer, right?
you've got key person risks, that sort of thing, on and on. And lastly, general operations and governance. Do you have the policies in place, the regulation? Do you have a high risk or at risk community? Are you working with children or the elderly? What are your program
Mhm.
operations? Generally, operational risk. So we think of those 5 areas, and some are going to be more relevant to others. I think that's a quick and dirty way that a nonprofit should look at those 5. And if they don't have the resources to do some kind of robust dashboard, but at least think about that with your staff and your board about which are the top 3 that could really kill us.
That's cool. Okay. So the third way that you are looking at the financial health or the resilience of a small to medium sized nonprofit is about growing, right? It's about growth. So break that down for us. What does that mean?
As we know, the world changes, and it could be that there are technology solutions that could help you get your program more efficiently and more effectively. During the pandemic, nonprofits that relied on the community to come to them. I'm in San Mateo County, which is in the Bay Area.
That's Silicon Valley for those people who
Silicon
aren't
Valley.
familiar with California. Yeah.
And we know about Sand Hill Road and the venture capital, and Facebook is here and Oracle has been here. But we also have a lot of poverty here along the coastline. And there was a nonprofit that was focused on immigrants on the coastline, and they had services to come in. But during the pandemic, they couldn't find them. They didn't have ways to access them. They had to think through, how do we find them? How do we have more connections? If they have cell phones, we have their numbers, that sort of thing. So being prepared for external changes is one. Dare I say, competitors. So nonprofits typically don't partner with other nonprofits that are in the same area. You may have, and I hate to say this, but you may have a lot of nonprofits in the area of human trafficking. I remember there was one point I felt like there was yet another human trafficking nonprofit, which is great that there are these nonprofits that are looking at that. But what you're doing is you're balkanizing or you're splintering that mission.
And the donor interest community, the pool of interested donors
Exactly.
who are really making that their top
Right.
donation priority. Yeah.
And so, remember, there are major donors out there who believe in that. They may write little checks or they may write one big check to one.
Yeah.
Either there's a collaboration effort because it's
Mhm.
not capitalism. This is serving a community. But unfortunately, maybe it's because we're Americans and we believe in this capitalist kind of mindset. A lot of nonprofits, ironically, say we have to take donations. They don't say that explicitly, but you have to think innovatively of that. How can we collaborate and do the most impact as a mission, as opposed to us little nonprofit that serves this little niche area?
So digging into this a little bit, because I know that you personally are a networker, right? You want to connect people. You've got a series of webinars and conversations, and you're constantly connecting one person to another. Literally could not think of the number of people that you have introduced me to. So you're a connector, Maya, and tell us a little bit more about how you are trying to foster this kind of cross-pollination particularly in the Bay Area in general, among different nonprofits.
No, that's a good point. We started a network, which is now called the Social Impact Advisor Network, which we had originally started to help us navigate the nonprofit world. It is very hard to break into. It's very balkanized, where both of us are part of the financial services industry, which is very, I wouldn't say cohesive, but we all go to conferences together.
People work on their own or they work for different employers. But if you're, for example, a professional financial planner, like you're going to conferences with people that work at all different kinds of organizations.
Yeah. And maybe your colleagues now go work for another one.
Yeah.
I know people who work at Fidelity and State Street and Charles Schwab because they used to work with me. But that doesn't necessarily happen in the nonprofit world. To some extent, I want to be fair. It's also made of, because you've got these different missions. It's a sector of how they prepare their tax statements. It's not really an industry, so to speak. You've got board members who come from all over. It's not really an easy sector to break into. So we thought, let's get together a bunch of professionals who want to, service professionals like you and me, I'd said IT or marketing or accounting or audit, bookkeeping, social media, who either serve nonprofits exclusively, maybe a large part of their book are nonprofits, or they want to get more into because they really like working with nonprofits. We came together to learn more about how nonprofits think. We found also that we were jumping into a sector that we really didn't understand their philosophy on operations. We come from deep Wall Street firms, which there are some similarities, but not a lot. This network is about, I'm going to say, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and it developed. We are now developing a directory for nonprofits. A woman said to me who runs a kind of a chamber of commerce of nonprofits, and she said, I know maybe one accountant who's willing to do nonprofit accounting, but I can't tell you if that person's good. So I would love to be able to see a whole list of accountants and what are their expertise and are they a fit for that nonprofit?
Mm.
Not, can you build that? And I said, hold that thought. This is going to take a while, but we finally were able to tell her at our social impact advisory network.com that we have at least about 50 individuals who span different professions.
Mhm.
And we are always looking to find more people who are interested to be on that list and be vetted.
And who want to serve, who feel driven to serve that specific type of organization.
And these
Yeah.
are high quality service professionals who've worked, some of them have worked
Mhm.
at very well respected companies or have worked with and had clients of very
Mhm.
well respected companies. They are providing that same level of service to nonprofits, whether bigger or
Mhm.
small.
So I just love how you are really trying to innovate in this space. You're blazing a trail in nonprofit financial guidance and coaching because it really hasn't been thought of this way before. It's great that you're in the Bay Area where there are so many organizations that you can talk to one, but I know you also work with people all across the country. Getting back to the investing question here, because we certainly had a rocky market this week. I know that many small to medium-sized nonprofits are trying to manage cash maybe over multiple years. So maybe they have a grant that lasts for 3 years or something. They say, okay, there's inflation. What do I do with my cash? And then they have an endowment or they're trying to build an endowment. And for those people who don't regularly work with this space, basically that's a pool of invested savings that is designed to grow to fund future programs or the future mission of the organization. So the last leg of the stool is, if I understand it correctly, is this investing for growth, right? So what does that mean?
As a financial consultant, investment consultant for
Yeah.
nonprofits, I think of really three areas. You've got your short-term cash, you've got your medium-term funds, and then your long-term. Most nonprofits, I'm saying not the large national ones that have a huge financial team,
But they're like a Fortune, the American Red Cross, like
exactly.
500 company. Yeah.
Often they think, I've got my checking account and someday I want an endowment. And for those of your listeners who don't know what an endowment, it's basically a restricted gift from a major donor who says, this money is only for puppies with cancer, as an example. And so you may not use it for anything else but puppies with cancer, or there may be a time bound. There's some kind of restriction. It could be indefinite.
And for those of you who've served on nonprofits before, there are tax rules as to how much you have to pay out of the income from the endowment and how you have to account for that. So there's some moving parts in that question, right? It's not just like your retirement account. Yeah.
Exactly. And usually you want a professional managing it. I've heard of nonprofit. You were talking about boards who are managing the endowment. Which,
No, I've heard of that. Yeah.
yeah, not a great idea if he's got resource strapped, but that's for long-term growth and it's a thing for an individual. You have more equity in that and you want to see that grow over time.
You have an investment policy statement that says, okay, here's how we're going to manage this money.
So I think a lot of nonprofits are not aware. It's quite funny that since interest rates and yields on fixed income have come up, there are a number of people who not been aware of this thing called a treasury, which has been around for, I'm sure, hundreds of years. I don't know, but for a very long time, T-bills, treasury notes and treasury bonds, but particularly T-bills, which are yielding. So there's a percentage rate that you can get over your investment of 3%. And you can make up to 3% over three annualized for parking your money for 3 months.
In this current market environment, which is we're recording this in the middle of September. So that's where right now.
Timestamp this.
Yeah.
But this is not really, these securities were not really worth much for a very long time. I think a lot of the public wasn't really looking at that unless you sat on a gummy desk, as one of our colleagues has. Now you can say, hey, you're going to sit on this money for 6 months. I sit in cash. You could do a money market, which is going to make some decent money now. But if you're not going to need it for 6 months to a year, and you have to have that money for your grants. You're not supposed to put grant money in like the stock market. If you have some unrestricted money that you want to buy a van or you have a program in a year, put it in a treasury, a T-bill. Maybe you could do a ladder if you're not sure about it. So there are a lot more opportunities in this kind of the silver lining in this crazy market that there are better yielding products than just sitting in your cash or CDs, which are just not really appropriate, I think, for a nonprofit that's sitting on $4 million in a checking account. They can be optimized far more effectively
Yeah.
today.
So I think one of the interesting things, and having masterminding with you for the past 3 years, is how you learned from talking to your clients, right? You learned how many people were making decisions about their longer term allocations, right? So they're coming to you with their endowment or their pension or whatever, and getting that together. You're helping them with the balanced allocation there. But in those conversations with people about their risk management, for example, you were discovering, right, that the managing cash in the short to intermediate term was a place that folks weren't really doing.
Thanks for raising that. You'd asked earlier in
Yeah.
this podcast about how have we changed our
Mhm.
thoughts. And we are a small organization, and we had, based on our experience with larger organizations, we were trying to go after the big money, which was endowment. That's long, patient money. It's where all of the big players in this industry wanted to go after. We found that a lot of our clients didn't have an endowment, or they had a tiny endowment, and they said, but we're sitting on $10 million dollars of cash that we have to deploy in a short period of time. And a lot of investment advisors don't want that money. We saw that as a service that we can provide and forget about the fact that's going to be drawing down. There's an effective way to manage the timing of that money, whether you're building a building for a school or you have a new program or you're starting a planned gifts. Where can we put this as we're growing for the future, and we're going to deploy that for new programs? What can we do with that? And
To preserve the purchasing power of the capital, especially in an inflationary environment, then the checking account, it's not going to be worth as much
yeah, I
spending
mean,
power in 5 years.
yeah, you look at a food bank that is probably killed on all sides with fuel prices and food prices. I heard from an executive at a food bank said their fuel prices are higher than their cost of food. And,
Wow.
and that to just deliver food and they're getting killed on all fronts. They have to be very effective in their cash management or liquidity management for those reasons.
Before we finish up here, what else would you say to either the nonprofit executive or board member that's listening? What do you want them to take away from this conversation?
Nonprofit leadership should understand that there are experts out there that can help them in a non conflict way. And what I mean by that is back to your first question, is presuming that your board is always going to be the best to be accountable for that. We have a marketing exec on our board, so we're going to have that person responsible for marketing. To be put it more bluntly, is we have someone who's a banker or an advisor, and we will have them responsible for our finances. That is a very myopic way of looking at that. If that person leaves, you have a key person risk. If that person's not effective, relying only on that person's network is also very myopic. I think trying to network and understand who are the experts and uniquely qualified to service nonprofits, we are out there. You don't have to rely on your small network or your board and your staff to get that done. We're hoping to provide those tools through the network and through our expertise to allow nonprofits to do better.
What is the best piece of advice that you have ever received?
Something I go back to all the time, and it's unrelated to this, is something my father said. I was in a challenging situation at work. It was my first job out of college, and I wanted his advice. He told me all of the things that I could do, but he said, I'm not going to tell you what to do because that's what I would do. You need to figure out what you're going to do based on what's right for you. And I said, but I don't know what's right. And he said, you can only make the decision, but what is right now? It may be wrong tomorrow. It may be wrong in a year, but you don't know that. Be comfortable in knowing that what you're doing, what the decision you make is right now.
Mhm.
And you can change that. You can't regret that you made that decision. Keep going back to that. That was some 30 years ago. I continue to remind myself with my business, with my personal life, I'm making the best decision right now for what is right for me.
Oh, I like that. I really like that very much. So, what are you curious about then, right now?
I'm just living one day at a time right now. I've always, as a risk manager, was always trying to figure out what could go wrong. Since so much has gone wrong over the last 2 years, I try not to do that anymore. And just, you're cautiously optimistic, as the term is, and try not to be anxious of what could be and live in the now. I'm curious about when success will be. But as you say, when you're curious, I'm not anxious about it. Know that success and happiness and fulfillment is around the corner, but it's always around the corner, which is
Mhm.
for me is what keeps me going. I'm not
Right,
trying
because you're always reaching for the next start. You're a runner, right? You are running to the end of the race, and then you're going to go do another one, right? So it's
yeah,
not like you. So you have success and happiness, but you're just reaching for the next race, right?
yeah. So I know I'm right. I'm running
Yeah,
a half marathon in in
yeah.
a few weeks.
Okay,
But I'm
that's really
thinking, okay,
impressive.
what am I going to
Yeah,
do after that
yeah.
half marathon? Not that
Mhm.
I'm finishing my running career after this half marathon. What am I going to do after? Am I going to do another one? Am I going to do a shorter one?
You're gonna go
Uh,
to Tough Mudder.
yeah. If I'm injured, how am I going to prepare?
I hear the risk manager Maya
Yeah,
getting up
it's hard
here.
to get away from.
Yeah. So just finishing up here, tell us where we can find you online.
You can find us at fairlightadvisors.com. We'd love for you to check out our website. Of course, you can find us at the social impact advisor network.com if you're interested in professionals who service nonprofits.
Oh, Maya, thank you so much for a really informative conversation today. I think we could have kept going for another hour.
I
There's a
know
lot
I
to
could
dig
talk to you
into
for
here.
hours. Thank
So
you.
there's a lot to dig into. So we're going to have to continue this in a future conversation. And until next time, thanks everyone for listening today. If you have a topic or a question about the podcast, please email us at podcast@reallifeplanning.com. Go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out all the other great content. Thanks.